Hello, biology students. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving break. We're going to start our unit on cell division and reproduction. So the first thing we're going to talk about a little bit, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I think it's so important, types of reproduction. So sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. Remember, we said sexual reproduction is reproduction involving involving two parents, excuse me, it's involving two parents. And asexual reproduction, production involving one parent. And we said the asexual reproduction, we really are just creating clones. And we actually did that in the classroom. Not that we're mad scientists, but remember we took some cuttings off of a plant and stuck it in water, and roots began to grow. There was no sexual reproduction there. It really was cuttings from one plant that we took those cuttings off, stuck them in water, and they started to root. So we know that there wasn't any, two parents or anything like that. So we actually did a little bit of asexual reproduction just with that plant. Sexual reproduction, we know, is involving two parents. And we did talk about the greatest advantage of that being that genetic diversity. Okay. We said sometimes there's a cost to sexual reproduction. There's a lot of energy spent finding a mate, and sometimes if populations are low, it might be difficult to even find a mate. But all of the issues and all of the negative sides of sexual reproduction, the benefit of that genetic diversity just so greatly outweighs the downside of sexual reproduction. So I know we mentioned, for example, in the white-tailed deer population, and let's say that, remember last winter was super cold and there was lots of snow, and that's really hard on the wildlife. And if you're a white-tailed deer that's born with fur that's just a little bit thicker, and maybe your metabolism, you can survive on just a little bit less food than some of the others in the population, then you actually, because of your different genetics, you might be more likely to survive. So eventually, over time, that can drive evolution of a species even. A couple of other terms that are important as we move through this unit. Gametes. So gametes are cells that are sex cells, like egg and sperm, for example, would be gametes. And gametes come from organs called gonads. So in humans, the organs that produce sex cells are ovaries and testes. So that's where those gametes come from. And then I just want to mention the term because it's mentioned in Odyssey Where, but conjugation is a type of reproduction in which one cell empties its contents into another cell. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I just wanted to kind of mention it, I guess, and define it for you because I know you're going to see this. Common only in very simple organisms. Okay, and then fertilization. Fertilization is simply the fusion of gametes to form a zygote. So that obviously happens in sexual reproduction. The zygote is just the two gametes coming together. So in humans, that would be egg and sperm. This is often called a fertilized egg. So this is a direct result of the fertilization process. And then types of fertilization. We have both internal and external fertilization. So fertilization that takes place on the inside of an organism is called internal fertilization. So obviously humans have internal fertilization. Birds have internal fertilization. That egg that a hen lays has to be fertilized before that shell forms on it. So that fertilization takes place, there's mating, and that egg is fertilized inside the hen before that shell forms, and the egg is laid. And external fertilization, obviously much more rare, but we see external fertilization specifically in organisms in aquatic, specifically fish. In that case, a lot of times the eggs are laid in the water and then by the female, and then the male comes by later and spreads his sperm over the top, and then um, hopefully, if everything goes well, then most of those eggs become fertilized. And as we move through this unit, we need to talk a little bit about chromosomes, and we have to have an understanding what chromosomes are. So we are going to talk about chromosomes. Chromosomes really are just tightly wound DNA. And homologous chromosomes are pairs of chromosomes. It actually makes more sense to talk about what a chromosome is first. So chromosomes are tightly coiled strands of DNA producing a rod-shaped structure. So what does that mean? Well, remember that you have DNA in all of your cells. And this DNA, they're very long, thin strands. And we talked about DNA and kind of, a little bit like that DNA is that genetic material and how important it is, and we find it inside the nucleus, and it's really like the blueprint. It's the blueprint of all the proteins that need to be made by our cells in order for all the proteins that are necessary in our bodies. So that DNA is really important, and we don't want to just have a whole bunch of strands of DNA just kind of laying around in our cells, even if it is inside the nucleus. I sort of like to compare it to if you're someone who knits and you have all this beautiful yarn, right? And you wouldn't just leave the yarn all unwound in your sewing basket or knitting box or whatever. And we want to keep it organized and orderly. So most people want their yarn rolled up in nice balls in a ball of yarn as a way to kind of keep it organized so it doesn't get all tangled and all knotted up. Well, our cells kind of do the same thing with our DNA. They don't want it just laying around in big gobs of messed up string inside of our cells. And so they don't roll it up in balls, but they organize it in these tightly coiled strands called chromosomes. So this is our DNA right here, or a picture of our DNA. So this is the DNA we kind of see in this sort of twisted ladder structure. And in our cells, the DNA wraps around these proteins called histone proteins, right? So these histone proteins are really there just to kind of help organize the DNA. It wraps around the DNA, and then it continues to coil tighter and tighter and tighter until it coils up in this rod shape. This is two rods of DNA together. So these are actually two chromosomes it's a chromosome that has duplicated, and we'll talk more about that. So when it's unwound in this sort of my ball of yarn that's all unwound in kind of a mass of string, that's actually what we call chromatin. So it's uncoiled DNA. And when it's all coiled up into that rod shape, we call it a chromatid. And so technically what we're looking at here are two sister chromatids that are joined together by something called a centromere. So here's our centromere right in the very center between these two sister chromatids. And it's like the little glue that so I think of it as the little glue that holds two sister chromatids together, makes a chromosome. But that's what the centromere is. And so this is the nice, neat little package that we find in the nucleus of our cells. And this is a picture of something called a karyotype. So what this is they took a human cell and broke it open and then lined up all those rod-shaped chromosomes, because in your cells, all the chromosomes you actually have two of chromosome number one that came from your mom, one that came from your dad, two of chromosome number two, one that came from mom, one that came from dad, two of chromosome number three, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes if people are having certain health issues, they might do something called a karyotype, or a karyotyping, where they actually do this, where they'll actually take a blood sample, they'll isolate the DNA from a single cell, and then they will microscopically go through and organize all the chromosomes and look at them, so you can see different chromosomes are different sizes. So some of the chromosomes are very short and don't have as many of these little dark bands on, which is, the dark bands are usually genes that code for a particular protein. Some of the chromosomes are much longer, and then there's X chromosomes and Y chromosomes, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But this is actually a karyotype. You are going to do an online lab where you actually are going to finish completing a karyotype for some patients. But they look for abnormalities in numbers. Again, you're supposed to have two of each of these. So if you don't have two, or you have less than two or more than two, sometimes it's a really serious disease. But sometimes, like with X chromosomes, sometimes there's an extra one, and there aren't a lot of problems that show up until a little bit later in life. So you'll talk about that, or notice that when you go through the lab. So I just want to show you a larger picture, because the one on the slides is really small. And obviously different species have different numbers of chromosomes. For humans, the number is 46. So you as a human are supposed to have 46 chromosomes. And we said two of each kind, two of chromosome number one, two of chromosome number two, and then all the way through up to chromosome number 22, and then you have two sex chromosomes. In sexually reproducing organisms, chromosomes occur in pairs because you get one of each of those pairs from each of the parents. And then that's what a homologous chromosome is. It's one of these pairs. So you have a pair of chromosome number one, that's considered a homologous pair, the two members of that pair. Diploid, di means two, so diploid, which also means 2N. And I know I think this is usually kind of confusing for students at first, but the more we talk about this, I think the more familiar, the more it'll make sense to you. So diploid refers to cells that contain both sets of a homologous pair of chromosomes. Most human cells contain, or are supposed to contain, 23 homologous pairs. And then haploid refers to cells that contain only one set of each type of chromosome. And guess what? Most of our cells are diploid. Some of our cells are haploid. The cells that are haploid are, surprise, surprise, egg and sperm cells. So they are special and unique and different than our body cells in that way. So haploid, I always think of, means half, or sounds like half. And we also say this is 1N, meaning it has one of each of the types of chromosomes rather than two like the diploid cells have. So we see this just in the egg and sperm cells being haploid. The other cells in our bodies are diploid. So most of our cells have 46 chromosomes. As it turns out, our egg and sperm cells have only half that many. And again, we'll talk more about that as we move forward. But if you think of, if this is an egg and this is a sperm, and let's say this has 23 chromosomes, this has 23 chromosomes, when they combine, they need to make a fertilized cell that has, in fact, 46 chromosomes.